Welcome, Specimen. Today is Tuesday, August the 23rd. For the record, today is the day Sir William Wallace is executed for high treason at Smithfield, London. He was beheaded, his 4 limbs were cut off, and then his head was stuck on a pike and shown atop London Bridge, whereas his 4 limbs were displayed separately in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth. So, on we go after this little joyous news for everyone. Today we are looking at the talent trees of Dragonflight and we are making a ranking. We are making a tier list of all of these talents for all of the specs based on what we have seen so far. As you know, Blizzard is hard at work, even if perhaps you have not seen it yet, in changing several of these talents. We have just gotten today/yesterday, we have gotten some changes to the Arcane Mage tree, for example. So we are continuing to get many changes. Very likely some 90% of the talents we see now will look nothing like what we will see in the release of Dragonflight, but it's always nice, it's always cool and interesting to start making these pretend tier lists about the power of the specs, you know, to play around the idea of the meta that is going to come in Dragonflight. So we are going to be rating all of the specs that we have seen so far, meaning that Demon Hunter is the only one out. Demon Hunter should come in the next couple of days in the next build of the alpha. Then again, just for fun, we can just preemptively dump Demon Hunter in the Copium tier because, well, you know, it's Demon Hunter. I would already be surprised if Blizzard was able to come up with 10 different talents for the class, considering how naked it is when it comes to options and variety. So let's just preemptively leave Demon Hunter there. We will update it once we see the talents for Demon Hunter. Let's start with the first in line, which is going to be Death Knight. Death Knight, of course, we're not looking too much into the class tree, which we will look separately. Just looking at the specs and how they work, I think Blood has been looking very nicely. They have plenty of very powerful options. In the end, Blood is already doing quite fine right now. Yes, don't be misled. A lot of the power that Blood has now is in its damage coming from the tier sets, coming from the borrowed powers that they will lose. But Blood is, for example, one of the specs that can get a bunch of these borrowed powers back with things like Insatiable Blade or things like Everlasting Bond, trying to remake a makeshift tier set in Dragonflight as well. So they still maintain a lot of their power that they have now. They are still looking quite good, so I would say the future right now is quite bright for Blood Death Knight. I don't see too many things to despair about for Blood DK. The other 2 specs, you know, Frost and Unholy, are still quite good, not as good as Blood, not as exciting as Blood either. Plus, you also have to consider their current situation. What can they bring already that could get carried over in Dragonflight? I think that overall, both Frost and Unholy are not looking too bad, but they're also not looking extremely good either. So I think they are above the middle cutoff. They are still in the top half of the talents, but not in this amazing state where you could see Blood Death Knight being, on the other hand. Then we follow with Druids. Druids are in a pretty volatile situation because they have not been receiving, if any, changes whatsoever since they were released as talents. There have been rumors about, for example, the lead developer for the Priest and the Druid talents leaving the company or being shifted to a different project. So Druid and Priest have been in basically an empty hole when it comes to the development, at the very least the development that the players can see, the changes that the players can see in the alpha. So it's gonna be of course quite depressing to go and take a look at all of the Druids. I think the better one, the ones that look the best, are Resto Druid and Balanced Druid. I think Balanced Druid is not as good as Resto Druid, but still is in a decent spot, all things considered, especially if you take in mind that they have not received any changes at all. There is definite room for getting better for Balanced Druid, and same goes for Resto Druid. I think they're both doing quite fine, probably even here as well for Resto Druid. Their niche, super high HPS, can get some very powerful combos right here in the end for Resto Druid, so it's not looking too bad. Where things get a little bit worse is of course for Guardian and for Feral Druid. Guardian has a few cool attempts at changing things, like giving them a whole bunch of arcane damage talents, for example, that could be interesting, but considering the problems they already have right now, considering even with borrowed powers that they were able to get in Shadowlands, they haven't really got going a lot. They had a few places here and there by the end of Season 2 and the start of Season 3, but they were quickly overtaken by Blood Death Knight, so they haven't really had too much of a bright expansion. And then of course you have the Feral Druid, which is Feral Druid is definitely one of the worst states when it comes to talents. Guardian Druid is not nearly as bad, but still in need of changes. After this we have the Evoker, which we are not gonna talk about too much because of course we don't really know about their performance, right, since we don't have anything to compare them to. After we have Hunters. Hunters is an interesting spot that might trigger many players, because apparently now you're getting spammed worse than some advertisement in your mail by news about the changes to the talents of Hunter in Dragonflight. I think we are now at nine different updates to their talents, so they have changed a whole lot since the start. Now it's getting even difficult. It's getting even difficult to gauge how much better they have gotten. They have definitely gotten much better. I think both Beast Mastery and Marksmanship have improved significantly. The one that has improved the least likely is Survival. I still don't like this entire set of talents dedicated to wildfire bombs and bombs in general, dedicating nearly 80% of all of your points to wildfire bomb damage. Overall, they have definitely gotten much better. Perhaps at the release of the Hunter talents, they would have ended up all here. Now, after the several changes, I think both Marksmanship and Beast Mastery can go in this spot right here. It's all good now. You just need to continue getting the tweaks you kept getting since the entirety of the alpha has been released with your talents. Right now, it's gotten significantly better. I am not sold too much on Survival, also because it is the one that can change the most compared to BM and Marksmanship, with things like Fury of the Eagle coming back, with things like Spearhead becoming a talent now in Dragonflight. So there is quite a few new things for Survival, unlike BM and Marksmanship, which are more of the same, so it's even harder to gauge right now, so I would put it here for the moment. After Hunter, we have Mages that just got a bunch of changes, particularly to Arcane. You still have the issue that Arcane is a problem of a spec on its own compared to Frost and Fire, but in particular Fire. Fire, ever since its release, even without the changes it got after, was quite well received overall by Fire players. There were some complaints here and there, but nowhere near the other specs that received way more complaints. So I think that for Mage, Fire, I would put them here, whereas Frost Mage, if it was up to my own preference, Frost Mage would be here, because I really don't like how Frost Mage plays, the 2-button spec based on procs of Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze. I don't like that playstyle whatsoever, but let's just imagine a fantasy world where players actually do enjoy playing Frost Mage. I would put them here, and then you have Arcane, which I still think needs a fix, because what is the point on continuing to play and set up Arcane to be a cooldown based spec if every single expansion, the cooldown based spec, becomes Fire Mage? At this point, Blizzard must have realized this. They must have realized that Combustion is just better than whatever tweaks to the cooldowns of Arcane you can make every single time. So I'm hoping there is some fixing to be done for Arcane Mage to just not make them once again a worse copy of a Fire Mage. After the Mages, we have one of our freshest releases, which was Monk, of this version of the alpha, this last week's version of the alpha. We have had an entire video, quite fresh, of a few days ago, so the recap, I would put that Brewmaster, interestingly enough, is our second spec in the top tier, and it's a second tank in the top tier. There is also Windwalker, which has gotten far better improvements to its builds. Windwalker has gotten quite some improvements to its single target, which has been its glaring weakness for a long time, and also has received a whole bunch of very, very high-end powers, very capstone-like powers, like legendaries for Invoker's Delight, Covenant abilities like Bone Dust Brew and Feline Stomp, several improvements to your Zhuen, triple improvement to your Zhuen cooldown. You got your Strike of the Windlord back, you have Kiefer's Skyreach that you can now use as an extra thing, plenty of cooler things, not to mention the whole build around the possibility of the new build around AoE damage of Touch of Death, so I think it's quite nice. There are some tweaks to be done anyways, but I still think the default version, even without any changes, even in its initial release of talents, it's looking quite good for Windwalker. Well, the one that looks the worst is Mistweaver. I'm not too sure if I want to put it here, because, you know, my main reason for putting them here for a few fixes rather than here is the belief I have that Mistweaver is currently the better shaped spec for healers when it comes to Mythic Plus and when it comes to damage. Plenty of other healers have lost a lot of their borrowed powers that gave them tons of damage, like Shamans and like Priests. Mistweaver, not really. Mistweavers in fact gained abilities to do more damage in Mythic Plus. They gained the ability to have Feline Stomp and Bone Dust Brew, plus also having Zemples, plus also taking Invoker's Delight for more damage. They can retake pretty much all of their combo for Fist Weaving. They have Teachings of the Monastery, they have Ancient Teachings of the Monastery, as well as the final point, Rise in Mist, for their damage setup, so that's why I wanted to put them a little bit higher, but overall, I guess I agree. I should probably leave them here for the moment, for the time being. After Monk, we have Paladin. Paladin has gotten quite a few changes over time. Overall, I think the better one is Protection. The amount of defensiveness given to Prot has increased significantly in the alpha. One of the stronger talents, Sentinel, looks insane, getting 30% DR together in your Avenging Rat. Plenty of other options like increasing your block chance by 20%, another 10% additional block chance right here. You have damage reduction, 25% damage reduction on your Eye of Tyr. You have plenty of ways to get less damage taken this one as well. Crusader's Resolve to let you take 12% less damage if you hit an enemy with 3 Avengers Shield. It's made it way more tanky. We'll have to see how it plays out in the end, but looks quite good at first glance. I am a little bit more doubtful about Ret, which looks quite good overall, but still you have to consider the current state of Ret, the current power of Ret in the meta, plus whatever they get in here. Still not as bad as Holy Paladin, which is definitely in a worse state right now. Way too many talents conflicting the two builds of Holy Paladin. The ranged caster build, which has not worked and has not been a thing for years now, compared to the melee build of Holy Paladin. I don't like how they don't mix and match whatsoever. It's much too much of a divide between the two builds. There is not enough interchangeability between the possibilities for Holy, so I don't like it whatsoever. I would put Prot Paladin around this level and Ret Paladin a little bit lower down, but still not nearly as bad as Holy Paladin, which I don't like at all in their talents. Then we hit a sour note, I have to say. We are hitting the sour note of Priest. You know, what is there to say about Priest? They haven't gotten any change in weeks now, in fact in more than a month, and the Shadow Priest is of course the worst of the trees. Discipline is perhaps the least bad. In fact, it looks quite good overall. It has quite a few strong powers for the ramp. They are even rampier than before. This is still gonna be a problem in Mythic Plus, but when it comes to raiding, they look even better than now. And then Holy Priest is the one perhaps in the middle. They lose, as mentioned before, a lot of their borrowed power to do tons of damage in Mythic Plus, but they don't lose Power Infusion, which is very good for them, for sure. And the rest of the stuff is not too great overall, so I would put the better of the three is Discipline overall, followed by Holy Priest, which is still not in too great of a situation once you consider that Holy Priest has been a meme of a spec for several years, except for this last season, this season 3 of Shadowlands, and that was just because of borrowed powers that they are losing in Dragonflight, so you can't be too optimistic about Holy. And then of course you have Shadow, which, you know, for the moment it just has too many issues that we will have to wait and see how it gets fixed. After the Priests we have the Rogues. Rogues have gotten also quite a lot of changes compared to other specs. They are amongst the top when it comes to series of changes. All 3 Rogue specs look very good, to the point that it's very difficult to make a ranking when you don't even know what matters most for Rogue specs, for a pure DPS spec, which is the damage, the simulations, the current output they can have. All 3 got some nice things. Of course, the default spec that is going to be the worst of the 3 is Subtlety. Why is it subtlety? Because subtlety has not been given a raid buff or a party buff or a pseudo mandatory buff or debuff needed for your raid, for example. So when assassination has a pseudo, perhaps even stronger devotion aura buff like atrophic poison, and when Outlaw Rogue has the much discussed about Restless Crew for cooldown reduction, by default both Outlaw and Assassination are looking quite good at the moment. I would honestly put them in this state. I think Assassination looks overall better than Outlaw, even though likely Outlaw, for example, would still be the better spec for, say, Mythic Plus, for example. I still think that the default talent trees looked quite good for Assassination, and then you have Subtlety. You know, the dangerousness of Subtlety isn't the terribleness of the talent trees. In fact, I was quite a fan of the talent tree of Subtlety. It's just the lack of a party/raid buff. When you put 3 specs that do the exact same thing, that have the exact same role, all 3 melee specs, and you give to 2 of them a party or a raid buff, and you leave the third one out, it starts getting a little bit dangerous for the third spec left out. After this we have Shaman. Shaman is also one of the specs and classes that received the most changes. Most of them were positive. Many players have lauded the good state of the specs overall. I think Enhancement was the recent one to get many of the changes. It looked very good. Elemental perhaps I think looks the least good out of the 3, which is not a bad thing. You know, it's still very good, but not as good I think as Enhancement and Resto. So I would put Enhancement in here actually at the moment, and perhaps even Resto Shaman. I'm gonna put it here just because out of community perception. I am a little bit sketchy on Restoration being this high, mostly because they, much like Holy Priest, they lose their Mythic Plus damage from their Borrowed Power, their Kyrian damage, and they don't really gain anything. They have to be bailed out, they will have to be bailed out by Acid Rain doing enough damage if they want to have consistent damage in Mythic Plus. So if it was me, I would probably put them closer to here, but I agree with the state of the talents being quite smooth at the moment for Restoration Shaman. As I said, Elemental is perhaps the only one lower down a little bit more compared to the other 2 Shaman specs. It is understood that overall Shaman is one of the better ones in terms of quality of talents for all 3 specs overall. After this we have Warlocks. Warlocks have been a couple of weeks out now. They have received a few changes here and there. Plenty of players have had varying reactions to the talent trees of Warlock. Many were happy, many were not happy. Some were happy because their spec now had a very clear improvement in their playstyle. Others were less happy because the spec didn't play as good or wasn't improved in how it played. Overall, of the 3, if it was up to me, the better looking one was clearly Affliction, mostly because of abilities like Deathbolt and the power given back to Haunt in way more single target damage. But this is not something many of the player base liked or enjoyed about Affliction, but luckily for me, it's my tier list, so I can put them here by myself. Meanwhile, other players were happy about the State of Destruction because it just empowered what they were already doing, and I don't really care because Destruction plays like shit and there is very few changes in the entire tree of Destruction. You just get back what you already have. Your infernal damage build, your scuffed version of your current tier set comes back in the Dragonflight talent trees, but I just don't like it at all. I don't like the way Destruction plays, and these talents don't do enough for Destruction. Demo is more of the same. At the very least, they build a little bit more into their identity, which is more demons, more summon demons, cooler summon demons. You have the Nether Portal, you have the summoning Pit Lords coming out, so okay. It's a little bit better, it builds up a little bit more on the playstyle of Demonology. I think if you enjoyed that, it's still gonna be fine in Dragonflight. The last of the set of classes is Warrior. Warrior has just recently bailed out Fury, which was the spec without War Banner available, which is the same problem that Subtlety had without having a party buff or a raid buff in the class. Now Fury also gets War Banner just like Arms, so the big problem goes away for Fury, which means both specs are looking quite good. I don't really enjoy Arms in the way it plays, but the talents themselves look good enough. I'm still not sold whatsoever on Arms AoE, but at the very least it's a better overall setup than what it was before. I still don't think it's great. I think it can be improved overall. I think Fury is the one that looks better in its talents compared to Arms Warrior. The last of the specs is Protection Warrior. You know, you have to consider the current state of Prot. Prot is getting a lot of cool things back, dangerously close to becoming another Thunderclap spam bot like it was in BFA, but at the very least that made it very meta in BFA. So maybe you enjoy the playstyle, maybe you don't. At the very least, what I can say for sure is that this setup can become much better than the current version of Protection Warrior. So even in the worst case scenario, I think it gets definitely improved compared to the current version of Protection. So this would be my overall setup for all of the specs of Dragonflight when it comes to talents. We will see later on, mostly because this video has already gotten on for way too long, about the class specific talents, which will have to play quite a big role in your spec. Obviously not as much of a throughput role, because most of the power of your spec, most of the DPS of a fire mage is going to come from these talents, not from these talents, but still it's 31 points over 30. You're going to be spending even more points down this set of talents, so it's still going to be quite relevant, but we have taken way too long to make this video, so we're going to stop here for the specs of the Dragonflight Alpha so far. It's gonna be nice. I wanted to make this video mostly because I wanted to keep it as a time capsule. 1 week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, when we can go back to how the talents have been, to how much the talents have changed, and see how many improvements have been made. You know, the dream scenario is to get rid of these last 2 tiers, these last 2 rows, perhaps even get rid out of as many specs as you can in this row, and try to keep all of the specs in these first 3 to see how many positive changes we will see. Of course, the Feral, the Shadow Priest, Subtlety, Holy Paladin, Mistweaver, and Guardian Druid are the ones I'm looking out for the most out of the specs, to see the changes that will come to these specs. And then obviously we have still the unreleased Havoc and Vengeance 3s, and we will see where we slot them once they come out in a couple of days. So with this being said and done, we have our first initial tentative tier list for the Dragonflight talents for the specs in the alpha so far. Let me guys know what you think, if you have experienced any of these in the alpha, if you're a main of one of these specs and you think they were better or worse. Perhaps you can enlighten me in the comments about the reasons why the spec is much better than it seems, or much worse than it seems in a Dragonflight Alpha as far as their talents go. But for now, we're gonna stop here. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters for allowing me to continue to produce content for WoW as we get closer and closer to the release of the beta of Dragonflight. Of course, don't despair, don't be afraid, I am still the CEO of the No Alpha company. Why would I ever leave that position, of course? And to further support, you can like and comment down below on this video, together with subscribing to the channel itself. That would be very much appreciated. Lastly, for further social meddling, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon right down at these 2 links. Now we have done and said everything there is to say. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, rest in peace, Sir William. You definitely did not deserve to be betrayed by your own kin and then drawn and quartered in such a brutal manner. I too am pressing F in the chat.